Hello, everybody, and welcome to our patch 6.2 live developer Q&A. My name is Josh Allen, also known as Community Manager Lore, and joining me here today, none other than lead game designer Ian Hazakostas. How's it going?
Pretty good. I've been looking forward to this.
Awesome.
Actually been looking forward to it for a while.
Awesome, yeah. So we got a ton of flying questions. We have a ton of overall questions that we're going to try and get through today, but we just wanted to start out and say we did get a lot of questions about flying. Obviously, the announcement earlier in the week that flying will be coming to Draenor in a future patch is something that has really helped quite a bit in answering a lot of those questions for us. So basically where I'm going with this is a lot of those questions were already answered, but we do have some follow-up questions, so just diving right in.
Sure. Let's get started. Yeah. A lot of questions to get to.
First question from Rixna says, curious about the 6.2.x implementation of the flying meta. Is it scheduled after 6.2 for development reasons, or to allow players to enjoy the world without flight before we all gain the ability to earn licenses?
It's mainly for development reasons. I think Azeroth, or Draenor as it stands right now, is largely flyable. I think anyone who has, an Aviana's Feather or a workshop can probably attest to that. You can get around in 3 dimensions just fine. There are, however, a number of bugs that we wanted to fix, that we feel like we need to fix in order to give players a really smooth, enjoyable experience when able to fly freeform. Things like potential quest flow issues that players could run into, or collision issues. And we had those bugs queued up, but ultimately put off fixing them when we made the decision that initially we weren't going to allow flying in Draenor. Right. Now that we have this new plan going forward to allow players to earn it, obviously we need to do that work.
Right.
And at this point, we're close enough to the launch of patch 6.2 that if we were going to do it, we would have to delay patch 6.2 to make that happen.
Right.
And that just didn't feel like the right call for players. We want to get you into non-jungle, into Hellfire Citadel ASAP. So we're going to break off a small little mini patch, do that work there, and get it into your hands as soon as possible.
Okay. Cool. Moving on. Next question comes from Morwell, who says, now that flying is coming back, how long will the 3 rep grinds attached to it take, and can they be done all at once?
Yes, so one of the core components of the Draenor Pathfinder achievement is getting the 3 to non-jungle reputations up to Revered. There's one core reputation for your faction, whether it's Alliance or Horde. Then there's one that's for the Arakoa presence in Tanan, and another for Sabron. And I think all 3 of those can be done in parallel. There are different methods. There are some daily or weekly quests involved in getting each of them. I think the one that is probably the most gated is the core Alliance Horde one, and ultimately that's going to take you something like 2.5 to 3 weeks worth of daily quests to do. So the very fastest, most hardcore people will probably have it done in around 3 weeks. Obviously, if you're not doing dailies 7 days a week, it'll take a little bit longer.
Right.
But the goal here wasn't to create a process that was going to take months and months and be super tedious. But it does, ask players to really explore and thoroughly engage in the content of Tanan Jungle before they can fly over it.
Cool. All right, moving on. Next question from Temerity Mist says, if the Pathfinder achievement model for flight access goes over well, do you guys see it as the model going forward?
So as we laid out in the blog announcing our new solution to the flying issue, I think that is something that we're optimistic about. We see it as a blueprint for how things could work in future expansions, future zones, future land masses that we introduce.
Right.
The idea of, being tied to the ground initially, experiencing the gameplay from the ground, but then being able to fly once you've explored it thoroughly makes a lot of sense. Obviously, we're going to see how this goes and learn lessons from it, and the exact form it takes and the exact requirements of the achievement may be something that varies depending on the content, but it seems like something that could really be applied in a lot of contexts.
Cool. And just real quick, I've seen a lot of people in that chat room asking about why we're answering so many flying questions. We kind of front-loaded them because we wanted to clear up a bunch of the confusion around the flying announcement. There are a lot of other questions that we will be getting to very shortly. We just wanted to clear up these few little things right at the start. So moving on, next question from Postura says, why add flying at the last moment? Personally, I like the game more without it. Why the sudden change of heart?
So ultimately, this was a hard decision for the team. And I know that there's a certain amount of cynicism about the decision. There are people who honestly believe, and it makes me sad that this is the belief, but I understand why, that we were basically lying to players, that we planned all along to never add flying back, and we were just kind of stringing people along for months and months. The reality is, it's a large design team, and this is a decision that's made by the team as a whole. And there were people on both sides, of the issue, and there still are to some extent. And so it was something that we were talking through quite a while. When we got to the point that patch 6.2 was going up on the PTR, we realized that, well, we needed to make a decision. It's not fair to players to just kind of keep this, murky and unresolved.
Yeah.
And so we went with what was sort of the, not full consensus, but majority view at the time, and that was obviously to not reintroduce flying. But obviously there was a lot of feedback, a lot of discussion that came up in the aftermath of that announcement. And I think it's something that we heard from players, and we also heard from people within our own team, that the word never is a very powerful word. And that once it was out there, a lot of people who were actually totally fine, being on the ground and exploring Draenor on the ground full time, started to think about, wow, I'm never going to get to use that Mimiron's head that I ran Ulduar for 2 years to get. I'm never really going to get to use Ashes of Alar in a way that doesn't look strange, hovering across the ground. And it felt like we were taking something very valuable away from players, and that really made us re-examine our decision. And we're really happy and satisfied with the compromise we came up with and the way it's been received.
Yeah, there's definitely a very big difference between no flying in Draenor and no flying ever.
Exactly.
So, and also, just as a side note, based on something you said just there, you sort of mentioned that we were kind of a little murky on our communications around it for a while. That's definitely something that we have recognized as an issue and are going to try to do better about.
And part of it was frustrating from my perspective, just as an individual, since obviously I was involved in the interview where that news first broke, and the fact that there wasn't more communication or more immediate response isn't because we weren't listening or because we didn't care. It's because we were talking intently amongst ourselves about this issue.
Yeah.
And it really wasn't my place or any one individual's place to speak on behalf of a group of people while the issue was unresolved.
Right.
And at the time, even saying, well, we're still talking about it, we're still debating, would have opened the door and gotten hopes up.
Yeah.
Because imagine if we'd said that and then decided to actually still keep flying unavailable, it would have just felt even harsher.
Yeah.
So it was a tough situation, but I'm glad that it turned out the way it did.
Yeah, definitely. It can be very, very difficult to make those sorts of communication decisions at times. All right, let's move along. Next question from Xylaria VG, who says, oops, wrong button. There we go. Why are current reputations all mob grinds? Seems like a step backwards. Can we get a more modern reputation system?
Yeah, the reputations in 6.0 release Warlords of Draenor, I'm not really going to defend them and say that they're awesome and fun and engaging. They are completely mob grinds. They're something that were added pretty late in the process. We originally weren't going to have reputations at all because it didn't really fit in with the structure that Draenor was designed around. But through the trading post and hooks for a couple of buildings, we had the idea of, okay, well, let's just kind of use this as a bar to progress towards, unlocking some cosmetic rewards or a few things here or there. And so we added some that I think it's unfortunate that it kind of set the perception of reputations as a whole back many years. We have come a long way since the days of grinding furbolgs in in Winter Spring or whatnot, and I think the 6.2 reps into non-jungle do reflect a different design. The core Vol'jin, Rin faction rep, you only get it through daily quests. It's not something you can go out and grind mobs for, because we kind of know that if we just let you go out and kill mobs in a field, what that really turns into is you go to the pre-made group finder, you find a farming raid, you just sit there and mindlessly AoE for 3 hours, and then you're done.
Right.
And there's not a whole lot of great gameplay there. We don't really want to encourage that. I don't think anyone really wins with that kind of a system. And so there are daily quests behind all of these. And there are some obviously that you can get by killing mobs into non-jungle, but for example, the Order of the Awakened is specifically driven by hunting rare mobs, and so it's about the rare spawn hunting in the zone, which is a little bit different from just going to a field and AoEing a bunch of plant enemies or orcs or what have you.
Yeah. Okay. Next question comes from Mortis Darkskull, who says, Apexis dailies feel like they take forever, and I just skip them every day. Any plans to bring back normal dailies?
Yes, I think it's definitely something, dailies definitely have a place. And I think we did that thing that we so often do where we overreact and we have this pendulum that, swings back too far in the other direction after, the perception of, World of Dailycraft and Mists of Pandaria and people who were, sick of doing Golden Lotus and Claxi dailies over and over again. We approached Warlords development wanting to find a different direction. And I think the idea behind the Apexis dailies, I think, has promise. We just didn't execute on it the way we should have or could have. The way we looked at it and the way we approached it was, if you think back to the core Golden Lotus dailies, you have Lao Softfoot trapped in his cage every other day.
Yeah.
You get sent there to also destroy a bunch of cannons, to kill 15 Mogu, and to kill one named guy, let's say. And it felt like players did that dozens and dozens of times over the course of Mists of Pandaria, but it felt very structured and narrow. And so we approached building the outdoor areas that were the targets for the mission table missions the way we approached building our daily areas in Mists of Pandaria. We were thinking of it as more flexibility and more freedom. Imagine if instead of, quest telling you destroy the cannons, you just got sent to an area and you could do a wide variety of things, from killing mobs to interacting with objects to looting things and using them elsewhere to killing rare spawns to discovering little secrets like, a hidden phase in one of the Frostfire areas, the Shadow Moon area that has extra bonus events that you can get to fill your bar faster. And it's going to be more about player choice and freedom. I think there is something to that idea. I think the two places where we clearly failed are that by removing quests entirely, I think we removed story and context. We removed the feeling of a sense of purpose for why you were going there, other than, hey, go here and kill a bunch of plant dudes. Go there and kill a bunch of orcs. It made it feel more nakedly grindy. Yeah. And then separately, I think the reward structure was a complete miss on our part. A lot of people did the mission table missions the first week or so because, there's this thing in my garrison saying, okay, go do stuff. Yeah. I don't know what these Apexis crystals are for, but I'm sure they're for something useful, so I'm going to go do them. And so you did a couple of them, and then you finally looked it up online or found the vendor in Warspear or Stormshield and realized, oh, wow, I don't actually want any of this gear. Yeah. I already have dungeon gear that's just as good as this stuff. And the raid gear costs so many Apexis crystals, I would have to do this for like 2 months to buy one piece. Yeah. Okay, I'm just out. I'm done. And that is a clear failing on our part. I think in 6.2, I think Tanan remedies several of those issues. There is more structure to the quests that send you to those places. You do have, a cover quest and more of a sense of purpose. But then also the Apexis crystals themselves, there's more to do with them. In sort of the Timeless Isle Burden of Eternity style, their value is more directly apparent, kind of like Timeless Coins were. You're getting items into non-jungle, and you have the ability to upgrade them all the way to 695 with a single, more affordable Apexis purchase that should give you something that's much more attainable to strive for.
Awesome. All right, let's move on. Next question comes from Sternhelm, who says, Draenor questing was a blast, but the endgame lacks world content, in my opinion. Things like dailies, gathering, PvP, lore, war fronts, etc. What's your philosophy on this moving ahead?
So I think we're obviously very proud of the level up content and the questing in Draenor. I think, again, some of this ties back into my previous answer. Obviously, I think we would have structured things like our Apexis areas and dailies differently if we could go back and do it again. Part of it does flow also from the garrison and the rewards that went into the garrison system. I think one of the issues and one of the potential missteps that we've made, we approached garrisons wanting to make sure that we were rewarding the system adequately, because it was a very core feature of the expansion, and we wanted players of a variety of playstyles to feel like there was a reason to care about their garrison, about upgrading their garrison, about upgrading their buildings, about getting garrison resources, about getting followers, about doing missions, all of that. And so a lot of different systems tied into the garrison. Right. And some of those systems are things that were traditionally served by the outdoor world. I think professions in gathering, I think, are a clear one, right? Miners and herbalists who used to kind of roam around the world, gathering resources, feeling like they could sell them for a pretty tidy profit, or the herbalist alchemist who liked being self-sufficient and uniquely self-sufficient, suddenly found themselves, in a world where everybody had more ore than they knew what to do with coming out of their mine, and where the profession buildings, were kind of constraining their ability to make things based on daily cooldowns. And so I think there was actually a fair bit of content out there. We just made it easier and more accessible to get the same rewards from your garrison, and thus there often wasn't a reason to go seek it out.
Yeah.
So I think our philosophy on that is outdoor world content is crucial. It's critical. It is tremendously important to World of Warcraft and any MMO. I mean, I think that's the core of a massively multiplayer online world.
Yeah.
And I think to the extent that we have neglected it somewhat, that's something that we see as a failing that we really need to fix.
Okay. Sounds good. Moving on. Next question from Manic Muffin. Says, I feel Warlords of Draenor has been geared towards the simple one-character play, and those with alts are burning out with all the upkeep. Is that by design? Obviously, a lot of that has been focused around the garrison, which you were just talking about.
Exactly,
as well.
right. Definitely not burning you out. Like, that is not designed. And I think so. Alts and playing alts are something that has become an increasingly popular thing over the course of WoW's history, as leveling becomes a bit smoother, a bit more streamlined. Back in vanilla Burning Crusade days, alts were relatively uncommon because it took you literally 200 plus hours to level a fresh character.
Yeah.
And so we recognize that tons of people there actively play multiple characters. I think where we come down on the general issue is that's awesome, but we prefer to see alts exist as to serve themselves. To have I have a healer alt because I've always wanted to heal and I play a warrior. Or I'm going to, roll this other class to PvP with and use that for arenas and BGs and gear them up and have my own progression experience playing my character. That's great. Where it becomes more concerning for us is where people feel like multiple alts should exist to serve my main character, where I should have 4 or 5 garrisons and maintain all of them and do all my missions and all my work orders and all of them just to earn more gold for my main, or just to send resources and things over to my main. So we're looking into, in particular on the mission front in patch 6.2, looking into having some diminishing returns on an account-wide level for some of the gold-yielding missions, things like that. I know ultimately it's a nerf. I'm not really expecting people or asking you to get excited about the fact that we're potentially nerfing the amount of gold you can get from running 7 garrisons. But the flip side is that it actually alleviates some of that pressure.
Yeah.
We don't want to reduce the yield and how lucrative it is for one character, but it's a problem when it just scales linearly and you're getting 6 times as much from 6 times as many characters and you feel like you have to log on and do all these chores every night. That's not a great place for the game to be.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I play a lot of alts, and keeping up with, I think I have 7 level 100s now. Keeping up with all those garrisons does get a little bit overwhelming at times. And a lot of that is because I'm running all of them for the gold. So while I will certainly miss the amounts of gold that I can get at the moment, I think I'm okay with that decision personally. Moving on, next question from Goose Comics asking, have you learned about what didn't work with garrisons and why no one leaves it? Every time I log on, all my friends are in the garrison. So we've been talking about that a little bit already.
Yeah, I think a lot of this has been covered by answers to the last couple of questions. Ultimately, a lot of it has to do with the rewards. It definitely is that the garrison often is the path of least resistance to the things that you want. And while we like the fact that there is a new time segment of gameplay that is introduced by the garrison, that is to say that you can log on for 5 or 10 minutes if you only have 5 or 10 minutes to spare, and feel like you're doing something. You can send some guys out on missions, you can check some buildings, collect some work orders. That's fine. If you have a few minutes before work, previously there was no point even logging on at all. Now there's something for you to do. That's good. It's less good if you log on when you have a couple of hours to spend and you can't think of anything rewarding or worth the effort compared to just spending a few minutes in your garrison and then logging off. Obviously, that's one of the risks of the road we've gone down. And I think we are actively trying to shift rewards back out into the outdoor world in a 6-2 time frame. I think changes to gearing, changes to professions and gathering into non-jungle are all geared towards accomplishing that. If you're a gatherer and you want Fellblight, you need to get out into the world. You can't just click on a garrison building or click on a node in your building and have it delivered to you instantly. Similarly, gear-wise, the raid missions are one of the most popular missions, obviously. You get your High Mall raid loot, you get your Blackrock Foundry raid loot from a box. And originally, those missions were all from a difficulty above what you were doing. So, your own guild would be working on Korag, let's say, in High Mall, Meanwhile, your followers are sending you heroic loot from Imperator Marduk that you probably aren't going to see for 3 or 4 months and may never kill. That really skewed the risk reward. And it also created weird situations where, somebody might spend, with their friends and family guild, might spend, a few months clearing through normal mode consistently, but in the meantime, they've actually gotten 7 pieces of heroic loot from their garrison missions. Now they're ready to start heroic, but they don't need much of the loot from heroic, and there aren't that many upgrades there for them. That's a weird situation to be in. So TLDR, garrisons over-rewarded you, and we're trying to shift the balance back into a more sane place.
Yeah, I think at least on one of my characters, the vast majority of the gear that I'm currently wearing actually came from garrison missions instead of from actually killing bosses. So that's good to hear that we're trying to move away from that. Next question, it's another garrison question, but it is, I think, a good one. It comes from Planeswander, who says, there has been pretty extensive criticism of the point-click-wait gameplay of the garrison. What differentiates the shipyard from being more of the same? Obviously, the shipyard is a similar system in some ways to the follower missions. So what makes that different?
I think it's more concentrated, it's more condensed, it's much less micromanagey. I think we feel like players have probably fully kind of mined out the space of followers and garrison missions. That's why we didn't just increase the item level cap and add a bunch of new missions, and that wasn't our approach to 6.2. We wanted to create a new system. When it comes to naval missions from the shipyard, you're going to have fewer boats that you send on missions less frequently for more individually impactful rewards. So I don't know, and obviously while there are some who've criticized the gameplay, it's not something that we reject fully, and there are plenty of people who like the gameplay. There's something about a sense of some offline progression, or sending your guys off on a mission before you go to bed, knowing there's going to be some reward waiting for you when you log on the next day. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. Feeling like you need to be checking back in every 30, 45 minutes to send followers out on more missions, that actually, I think, detracts from gameplay and from your sense of what you're doing in the world. We think that this actually strikes a better balance.
Okay, cool. Just real quick, I want to mention something. I see a lot of people talking about like fixes for PvP in the chat room. Ian is not the person in charge of PvP in the game. That's something that obviously you're aware of what's going on in PvP and stuff as one of the lead game designers, but that's more in the Brian Halinka court. So we aren't really focusing too closely on PvP questions in this Q&A.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about class balance, everything along those lines, but at some point, Brian is the better person to address
absolutely. And
hardcore PvP questions.
I do know that there's a lot of stuff that Brian wants to be able to talk about, and I'm going to try to find ways to get that information out as well in the relatively near future. But again, not particularly this Q&A. It's not the best place for that. So let's move on to the next question. It comes from Espinasu. Pretty straightforward question. Will future expansions have something like Garrisons 2, or will Garrisons stay a Warlords of Draenor only thing?
So I think something we've said really from the outset of Warlords is that the Garrison, as you know it in Draenor, is something that is rooted and tied to Draenor, right? This is a building, a base that you have built on the planet of Draenor. Your shipyard exists on Draenor, and that is going to stay there. You're not going to be bringing your mine and your blacksmith and your trading post and what have you with you back to Azeroth. But the core gameplay, is there some form of the idea of having followers or building up an army or building a base that we could preserve and carry forward? Absolutely. Is it likely to take the exact form that Garrisons did in Warlords? Almost certainly not.
Yeah, I think definitely, especially with a lot of stuff you just said, like there's a lot of lessons that have been learned about Garrisons at this point. So I don't think that we will just pick it up and drop it into a future expansion somewhere. But yeah. All right, moving on. Getting away from the Garrison questions, this one comes from Luna Vale, who says, there has been a truly massive decline in raiding guilds. Do you still feel that changing the raiding paradigm was a good idea? So things like flexible, normal, and heroic mode, and then the 20-man mythic mode.
I'm guessing this question probably alludes specifically to the fixed size mythic. I know that was a transition that was very challenging for many former 10-player heroic guilds. Many of them merged or recruited. Others have struggled along the way. I don't know that I would actually agree with the premise that there's a truly massive decline in raiding guilds. There are definitely a number of high-profile guilds that have disbanded, but that's something that's happened in every expansion, every raiding tier throughout the history of World of Warcraft. I remember, When Death and Taxes faltered back in Sunwell, people were saying, wow, this is crazy. Death and Taxes is stopping raiding. Well, that's always going to be the case. There are always groups that come and go. Yeah. And ultimately, the glue that keeps guilds together tend to be a small handful of leaders and officers who invest a tremendous amount of their personal time and energy. Yeah. And as they move on in their lives, as circumstances change, it's very common to come to a point where you're just no longer willing to put that time in, and that's how guilds break up.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. Like, we've seen guilds like Blood Legion running like 7 different alt raids at certain points and stuff like that. Like, that's a ton of effort that you can only, like, human beings can only do for so long.
Yes, the very, very high-end world first raiding is a whole separate story these days. That's kind of a ridiculous arms race that just continues to escalate. But getting back to the core question, sure. I do feel like changing the raiding paradigm was a good idea. It's one of the things that I think we're overall satisfied with. I think there's nothing but wins all around, from the flexible structure, 10 to 30 player scaling for normal and heroic, having separate lockouts, having them cross-realmable from the start. We've seen tons more participation in those raid sizes. I think on the other end of the spectrum, for the small percentage of players ultimately that do engage in Mythic raid content, they have gotten a better experience out of the fixed 20 player size. We're able to design encounters that are tuned for a specific raid size, rather than constantly struggling and often failing to balance 10 and 25 and getting them equal. And we're able to explore some different raid mechanics that we otherwise couldn't have. And in a competitive sense, it settles some of the, well, who's the real best guild, or what's the real world first, 10 or 25? There's just one condensed race, one solid league for that competition to play out in.
Okay. Next question, kind of looking at it from the opposite perspective, from Ryan Glover asking, is Mythic, with its precise tuning, extra gear art, mounts, and bonus fights, justified when such a small percentage of players even attempt it? So why do we have Mythic at all, really?
A couple of reasons. I think it's something for people to aspire to. It's something that allows the very best players to differentiate themselves from each other and to sort of prove who is the best and how great they are. There is some value to that. In as large a game, it's useful to be able to answer the question, who is the best? And that's why I think you see sort of competitive niches in almost every game out there. But at the same time, I would actually say that Mythic and the creation and existence and maintenance of Mythic also consumes a small percentage of the resources that go into making a given raid. The reality is, I would say it's a single-digit percentage if I had to quantify it, right? It's probably something like, if we just decided to cut Mythic difficulty, it would probably reduce the amount of time that goes into making raid zones by like 5%, maybe 10% at the very highest. Most of the effort comes into play when we're actually just creating the zones on an artistic side, making the geometry, the textures, the lighting, everything that goes into that, the bosses, all of the gear, and then tuning, designing the abilities, designing the encounters, everything across the board there. Coming up with an extra mechanic or two and doing some testing focused on Mythic, not actually that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. And so we do feel like it's justified in creating this environment for people to prove themselves and have the ultimate challenge waiting for them. But let's be clear about it. Ultimately, it's the vast majority of the player base that justifies the continued existence of raiding and the resources that go into it. It's the people who are doing normal mode, raid finder, what have you.
Right.
And everyone else just kind of gets to benefit.
Cool. Next question from Badadin, who says, why limit time walking to certain bonus time periods? I'm still not going to do X other event if I do not like that content, but instead I get to do the content I'm interested in less often.
So, part of this is the structure of our rotating bonus events. The goal isn't necessarily to force or encourage everyone to do every type of content. If you don't do pet battles, I don't necessarily expect you to say, okay, well, there's no time walking this weekend, I guess I'm going to do pet battles. If you hate pet battles, don't do them, that's fine. Same deal for PvP or dungeons or what have you. I think the answer to that, though, really is that it focuses some of the purpose of time walking. It creates it it makes it a more condensed activity that is there to help gear up your alts, to serve as catch-up. You can get some loot from it. But it also solves the problem of how it fits in with respect to other dungeons. I think one of the core problems we've always been trying to solve as we thought about time walking internally is, how does time walking fit in alongside new dungeons, new content that we release? If time walking gives you better gear than those dungeons, or even, if it gives you better gear than those dungeons, then why do those dungeons at all? And is the world we want to be in where we release a new expansion, we release new dungeons, and people are going back and running Alcatraz and Shattered Halls instead of our new dungeon because it's more rewarding?
Yeah.
That's not ideal. If it gives you loot that's the same or worse than the other dungeons, then people are going to run the new dungeons and look at time walking and say, what's the point? By having it available in a limited window, we can say, actually, no, it's going to give loot that's better than the regular dungeons of the current expansion. It's a bonus activity. But it also reflects the fact that, honestly, this content, it's great for a nostalgia trip. It's great to go see, for the first time in a few years, or maybe you've never seen them at the appropriate level in a group. You've only seen them solo or never at all. And it's good to kind of do that every now and then. But it actually doesn't really hold up as well as the content that we make these days as something that you would want to run 7 days a week, 4 weeks a month. So, confining it there, I think gets the best of both worlds in terms of the gameplay that we want. It allows the reward to be more meaningful without spilling over and clashing with other things.
Okay. Next question from Clatterbro, asking, Dungeons and Warlords of Draenor went obsolete pretty quickly. Are there plans to tackle this issue going forward so content doesn't go to waste?
Yeah, that's another of our regrets when it comes to Warlords and the way the launch cycle played out. I think we're really proud of the dungeon content that we made. We think we made great dungeons, but without a currency like Valor or any other reason to keep returning to those dungeons, a lot of players did them for the first few weeks, got to a point where LFR came out, or they had gotten loot from their garrison missions or from raiding, and there really wasn't any reason to go back to them. I think Mythic Dungeons and the introduction of Mythic difficulty for our existing Draenor dungeons represents a way, to some extent, of salvaging that and giving players a reason to go back to dungeons that they probably stopped running sooner than they wanted to. Mythic Dungeons really, despite their name, they're not there for Mythic Raiders. Mythic Raiders are probably not going to find a huge challenge, but they're there to keep dungeons relevant to players who have item level 660, 670 gear, normal mode raiders, people who are doing LFR, people who are getting loot from other sources, but still really enjoy running a 5-player dungeon with their friends, but haven't had a reason to do so in a really long time. So Mythic will do that in 6.2. Going forward, definitely for the next dungeons that we release, it's something that we realized we need to solve better. We weren't part of why we didn't keep Valor going forward is that it also always felt weird that you kept running the exact same dungeon, whether it was in Wrath of the Lich King or in Mists of Pandaria, from the launch of the expansion to the very end, for progressively better rewards as the difficulty got lower and lower and lower. Because the Valor points that you were getting were buying you better gear or being used to upgrade better gear, and the dungeons were somewhat challenging, relevant in 5.0, pretty easy by 5.2 when you had Throne of Thunder gear, and then when you were running them in 5.4, it was just a joke where you would AoE down an entire wing of them at a time. And at that point, we felt like they kind of overstayed their welcome. So I think the trick for us is to find, we'd rather find an approach where the difficulty of the dungeon can scale somehow, and that's the kind of thing we're thinking about in the future, so that it feels like you're doing relevant content and not just stomping easier and easier stuff, because I don't think that's what people probably enjoy most about dungeons. You want to feel like, even if it's not super hard, like what you're doing matters.
Right, yeah. Totally. So that sounds super interesting. Here's a question from Hunter MG96. Says, so no new dungeons, but rehash time-walking dungeons and adventure journal to highlight old content. Is that the plan going forward? So sort of asking the question of why time-walking instead of just adding some new dungeons.
We don't see it as instead of. I think that's really what it boils down to. I agree, right? It would be a terrible value proposition for players if we said, okay, we're not going to add new dungeons. Instead, we're just going to send you back to old stuff.
Right.
But that's not a reason to not add new features like time walking or the adventure journal, because they're not in direct competition.
Right.
Time walking is a feature that we've wanted to do for a while, and that really the majority of the work rested on our programmers, our engineering team, to create the tech that allows players to scale down and the rewards to scale up, and that's the nature of the content. Similarly, the Adventure Journal, totally different audience, right? The point of that, it's not content, it's a guide. It's a tool to help players who are returning or maybe aren't sure what to do as they're leveling, figure out, what content is out there for me, what should I do right now? That's something that becomes increasingly relevant as we release new patches. It's something we started thinking about actually back in Mists of Pandaria in patch 5.1, 5.2 or so. We would see in patch 5.2 Isle of Thunder was out, but a new player would hit level 90, and immediately they had a whole bunch of quests telling them to go do Golden Lotus, go do Plaxi. And it wasn't clear, unless you had a friend to tell you, actually, you shouldn't do any of that right now. You should just go to Timeless Isle where epics rain from the sky, or you're wasting your time. That just wasn't at all clear in the game, and so we wanted to make it more clear in the game. That's what the Adventure Journal serves, and that feature was produced in collaboration between a couple of designers and mostly the UI team and UI work. The people who would have been making new dungeons were focused on making Hellfire Citadel Raid, and that's kind of the art side of the pipeline. We always want to make new content. We always want to do as much as possible, but when it comes to what's going to go into each patch, it's just a matter of figuring out, who's going to do what, and at some point we have to just draw a line in the sand and say we need to get the patch into players' hands rather than try to put more content in it but delay it further.
Is that why there weren't new dungeons in 6.2?
I think, again, it's just a matter of art resources and what we're going to prioritize. And the 13 boss Hellfire Citadel raid won out this time.
Yeah. So just to get back to something you were saying a second ago, just to maybe clarify a little bit, because I saw a lot of people asking questions about it in chat, it wasn't a factor of instead of making time walking, we're going to do 6.2 dungeons or something like that. There just weren't going to be dungeons in 6.2.
Yes, exactly. Time walking is something that we've wanted to do. We've probably talked about it for 3 or 4 years now. It's the words come up at BlizzCon and interviews here or there, and we finally had enough of the pieces in place from other systems that we could say, actually, this isn't going to take a whole lot of extra work to get into the patch. Let's do it now, because it's better to have it than not to have it, and that's just a win for players.
Okay. Next question. I think you talked about this a little bit before, but it's from SharonCole92, who says, what place do you see Time Walker Dungeons as having when even LFR and Honor Gear is far better and easier to grab?
I think ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, we see Time Walker Weekend is a great time to quickly gear up your alt. It's not LFR gear, is pretty comparable to what Time Walking is going to give you, particularly if you get Warforged items out of Time Walking. But you can chain run those dungeons, whereas LFR is a one-time weekly lockout.
Right.
And Honor Gear is obviously an option, but a lot of people aren't necessarily looking to go into PvP. If you are, then feel free, right? Honor Gear is a great alternative. But it's, sort of Altapalooza is the idea when Time Walking Weekend is in effect. But then there's also the bonus weekly quest associated with that event that gives you an extra bonus roll that you can use on your raid loot for completing a few Time Walker dungeons. And that's the thing that should make basically every player, regardless of gear level, who cares about an extra bonus roll, feel like they should at least check out the system. And because Time Walking scales you down and scales your items down, regardless of whether you're wearing 650, 690, or 720 gear, when you go into a Time Walker dungeon, you're going to have a roughly comparable experience.
Yeah, and certainly there's a lot of people that, maybe not the people who are currently watching this live Q&A, but the sort of people who don't even do LFR and don't want to do PvP, and they would rather just stick to the smaller 5-man content. Time Walking is going to be great for that.
Exactly. More choices, I think, never hurt.
Yeah, totally. Next question from Mortis Darkskull, getting straight into the point.
Yep.
Why are you guys nerfing Demonology Warlocks to the ground?
Because we'd rather you didn't play Demonology. So let me elaborate on that. So we're not actually terrible at math. We weren't just, intending to nerf them a little bit, and we are really bad at numbers and overshot the mark a lot. We have some concerns with how Demonology plays as a spec mechanically, in terms of the amount of debuff juggling that goes into it and what's required to play the spec properly and well. It's not super intuitive. You often need a number of UI mods to help you do it well. If you go look at a guide like Icy Veins, it's an incredibly complicated priority hierarchy. And that's great, but what we saw, because Demonology was the best all-around spec performance-wise, over the course of the expansion, we saw Warlocks who really preferred to play Affliction or Destro, gravitating towards Demonology. In the first weeks of Highmaul, you saw plenty of Affliction locks, plenty of Demo locks, plenty of Destro locks. And looking at stats month after month, we've seen that pie increasingly gravitating towards basically all Demonology Warlocks at the highest levels, and we weren't happy with that spec in particular being what players felt like they were forced to play. And then a lot of people, it was a trap where, it's a complicated spec to play, probably the most complex of the 3 Warlock specs, but they would see and read, oh, this is the best spec, and, go look up how to do it correctly. If they went to Icy Veins, there was a wall of text. If they went to a site like Noxic, they were probably being misled and getting misinformation from that, and that could just lead them completely astray. We have plans to pretty significantly overhaul Demonology Warlock as a spec going forward. That's not happening in a 6.2 scope because we don't want to make that massive type of change in a patch. Demo is still viable. It's probably not the best spec. I would probably not expect to see tons of them in Methods Raid or Paragon's Raid or what have you. And Affliction and Destro are doing great. We've seen Warlocks putting up great parses, getting great numbers on PTR. Warlocks as a whole are in a good place. For those of you who love Demo and it's your favorite spec, I apologize. It's viable, but it is not the best. There is certainly an ebb and flow. Specs have taken turns being the best, being the worst over time. For now, it's Demonology's turn to be the worst Warlock spec.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, and certainly we've gotten a lot of feedback, even from hardcore Demonology Warlocks, that are just kind of upset with how the spec has been playing at the moment.
Yeah.
So it's more of just we agree this spec is not the best that it could be at the moment. We would rather not have it also be the best spec numeric.
Exactly. And it's not a matter of us saying oh, we don't like this. If you're playing it, we don't want you to play it. We're trying to dictate how you're having fun or not. But the fact that we saw people who preferred to play Affliction and Destro gravitating overwhelmingly towards this spec made us feel like it was a problem.
Right. All right. That was exciting. Next question comes from 1990 Sanji, who says, do you feel that ability pruning went too far? Rotations feel simplistic, missing, and even difficult at times.
Honestly, I don't. I think, in some cases, I think you can argue that ability pruning didn't go far enough. There are some buttons still left over, Unleash Life/Flame, the various Unleash Elements versions for Shamans, for example. Is that really needed? Probably not. I think philosophically, our goal here, and that's not to say that there aren't some places where we probably did prune abilities we shouldn't have. The class fantasy suffered as a result, or players who thought of an ability as iconic to their spec or class didn't lose it and feel like they were missing out on something. But part of our thinking here has to do with the place of rotations and how that should fit into the game as a whole. We're not trying to design rotations to be engaging when you're fighting a target dummy. If we were, we'd be making a game kind of like, a crazy MMO version of Dance Dance Revolution, where it's like a rhythm game where you're trying to multitask and, keep 3 things up while hitting a complex sequence of buttons. And that could totally be an engaging game. But that's not the situation that most players find themselves in doing almost anything of importance in the game, whether it's raiding or PvP. You are getting out of fire, you are interrupting, you are worried about the new ad that's going to spawn that you have to switch your DPS to, you are trying to LOS something while keeping an LOS of your healer behind a pillar in arena, and so forth. There's a very high skill cap overall, and ultimately, if we try to overburden players by making rotations that are themselves challenging and difficult to pull off, even while fighting a target dummy, I think it leaves things in a pretty hopeless place for the average player when they're also in a situation in a raid encounter or in PvP. There are very, very, very few, if any, players in the game who actually play at the skill cap. You can look at the best PvPers, that's certainly self-evident. It's the same people at the top of the ladder consistently. And in raid guilds, the difference between someone in, let's say, Method or Paragon, or someone in even a top 20 guild, let alone a top 200 guild, let alone the average guild that's recruiting and running on your server every night, is just incredibly massive. And so we don't feel like there's a low skill ceiling there. What we'd rather focus on, and I think what a lot of our changes that we're looking towards making are focused on, is improving the fantasy of playing your class, the feeling of being a fire mage and feeling awesome. And I think a lot of our classes fall short in that regard right now. A lot of that comes down to things like visuals and animations as much as the abilities themselves or the rotations themselves. I think when you're a rogue, for example, rogues probably suffer maybe not the most, but as much as anybody from this sense of lacking unique, really distinctive animations that make you feel like a ninja or like a badass that's, darting in and out of stealth. You're just kind of stabbing something occasionally and playing the same anim that you've seen for years and years. And we think we can do better than that.
Okay. Next question. Sorry, just trying to get through as many of these as possible.
Sure.
Comes from Lednuku. Says, how do you see throughput healers enjoying a game in a world still dominated by absorbs?
So I think the game is less dominated by absorbs than it was in Mists. So we've at least been somewhat successful in that goal. There is more healing where people are not, either full or dead. And in that world, absorbs are completely dominant, and that's kind of the world we were coming from. I think the problem is that Disc Priests and the niche of absorb-centric healing is probably one that we need to scale back going forward. That's not something that's changing in 6.2, but the reality is that if you have any raid comp, basically, any number of healers, you probably should have one Disc Priest plus something else. I've heard a lot of feedback from Holy Priests who feel like, they are not sufficiently powerful or that they need help. Actually, Holy, and forgive me for this, I think Holy Priests are in a great place in terms of how versatile their spec is. They have a lot of capabilities to do a wide variety of healing. They have good throughput numbers. The problem is that if you only have one priest in your raid, that priest should be disciplined.
Yeah.
They just should be, because as good as a Holy Priest may be, they're not doing anything that, to some extent, a combination of a Resto Druid, a Mistweaver, maybe a Shaman to some extent, couldn't cover, whereas the Disc Priest is providing this unique benefit.
Right.
And they're providing a unique benefit that often comes actively at the expense of the fun and enjoyment of other healers, who derive pleasure from refilling bars that are emptied, whereas the Disc Priest stops the bar from emptying in the first place, and often leaves the other healers feeling like they're just, blanketing HOTS or topping people back off from 85% to 100%, and that's not super fun.
Yeah.
So I think there's something interesting about absorbs as a mechanic, but having a spec that's identity has increasingly become it just blankets absorbs and provides absorbs over the whole raid. And, if 50% or more of your throughput as Disc Priest isn't Powered Shield or the equivalent, you're doing it wrong. That's not a great place for the spec to be.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also kind of along a similar line, specifically the comparison between Holy and Disc to what you were talking about with Demonology earlier. Like, I think if Discipline wasn't so strong, we'd see a lot more people playing Holy. Like, personally, my priest is Holy. And I feel like I do actually pretty well as a Holy Priest.
You're doing it wrong.
I'm doing it wrong. I should be playing Discipline. Sorry. My bad.
Your raid leader's doing it wrong for not making you spec Disc, is actually what it boils down to.
I kind of am the raid leader, so I get to just
do
it wrong on purpose.
You're doing it wrong.
All right. Next question from Deathcrick asking, while some changes were good, professions I find really boring and constrained in Warlords of Draenor. Are there any changes planned even in the next expansion?
Yes, I think I touched on this earlier, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I think, the mixture of the garrison-centric nature of gathering and crafting definitely constrained some things. And then the fact that you needed daily cooldowns or time-limited cooldowns driven primarily by work orders through your buildings constrained them even further, and got away from the sense of being a craftsperson that's actually making a sword or making a leather hauberk, and more just, okay, I'm collecting my stack of daily cooldown mats, and that's what's going to determine what and when I can make things. And so in 6.2, we are massively increasing the yield of people's personal cooldowns to make the materials that you create with your personal cooldown more impactful relative to what you're getting from your garrison building. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, Fellblight as a material is something that's back out in the world. And I think, in general, when it comes to professions, things that get you out into the world and make that meaningful, I think, are a better direction for that system as a whole to be.
Okay. Next question from Rebdul says, what's the ideal mythic fight length? And were some mythic bosses too long? For example, Imperator, Brackenspore, and Maidens. I'm sure I mispronounced Imperator, by the way. It's probably Imperator.
Imperator, yeah.
Okay,
It's a Latin for emperor.
My
bad. Yeah, people call him Impregnator, so whatever. The ideal mythic fight length, there's no one answer to this. I think we see fight length as something that's determined by the nature of the fight and the type of mechanics. If it's a fight that has the same mechanics by and large from start to finish, it probably shouldn't be much longer than 5 or 6 minutes, unless it's specifically set up as an endurance fight that's going to ramp as you go. If it's something that's cyclical, where you go back and forth between, let's say, a phase A and phase B, there's a vuln phase or something like that, you can probably stretch it out a little bit longer. And then when you have your sort of more classic end boss style, 3 separate phases with different abilities and intermissions between them, that's where you start to see the 10-minute plus fights. So I think overall, we're pretty happy with how fight lengths turned out in Tier 17 as a whole. Brackenspore, I think, honestly, part of what made that fight was the sort of endurance aspect of it. I think keeping the moss mold stuff in check for long enough, keeping up with the ads moving around. It was a long fight, and this is subjective to some extent, I don't feel like it got dull or boring as a result. Mythic Margok, Mythic Imperator, that probably was just too long. And that's the product of, the extra Mythic bonus phase after what was already a pretty full and thorough 3-phase fight. I think once we start to get to like 15-minute fight length, that's probably more than any fight really should be. And that's on us for not having caught that and found a way to condense the fight back to a more meaningful time frame while still introducing new mechanics along the way. Because wiping at minute 14, or even worse, seeing a brand new phase that you're going to have to wipe to multiple times and learn that comes at minute 13 of a fight is pretty rough. It was rough on Heroic Ragnaros, it was rough on Shaw of Fear, and it was rough on Margok. Maidens, I think, given its structure, the length was about right. However, I think it was too slow early on, such that the first half of the fight felt like there often wasn't a ton to do. And I think that's an issue with the design of the encounter in particular, and also to some extent the strategies that people employed. A lot of people, if you rush through it and push them to 20% with only 2 boat phases, then I don't think it's actually a super long fight. But a lot of people time the 3rd boat phase with pushing them below 20%, and that actually entails stopping DPS entirely for a while at times. And so, there's no version of a raid encounter, I think, where you're stopping DPS for a minute straight, where you're going to stay engaged and feel like it's not dragging on a little bit. So that's our fault.
Moving on, next question from Yun, who says, from someone who's played since 2005, I'd really like to know this. Why do you keep making everything so convenient? And also, do you feel the game is becoming too convenient?
That's a tricky question to, I guess, wrap my head around. I mean, I think ultimately we don't want inconvenience and nuisance to be the things that stop you from doing something. If we look at something like, but at the same time, we also have to be mindful of the downsides of convenience, which we are. Certainly travel. Obviously, flight is a hot topic. If we offer teleportation or too freely around the world, that tends to shrink the feeling of the world. That's something we learned in Cataclysm, where because the zones were disjointed, you just had a set of portals in your capital city, and you could just instantly warp to whatever zone you wanted to go to. That made it feel like less of a world. Similarly, there's no question that a risk of something like the matchmaking group finder, while super convenient, also does reduce some of the social interactions that players would have, spamming trade chat looking for a group for 90 minutes.
Right.
But the flip side, if we look at something like the pre-made group finder that we added in Warlords, that seems like a strict improvement over spamming trade chat for 90 minutes. That is still a social system where you are actually finding a group leader, you're applying, you're being invited, and it's not random match made. If you meet a great tank through that feature, you might add them to your friends list and look them up next week when you're doing your pug run again. That's I think a strict improvement. So I mean, in general, we want to identify things that are preventing people from enjoying the game in the way they would like, and removing those barriers where possible. But I mean, there is something to be said for being wary of removing too many barriers, kind of reducing the size of the world or the feeling of the game as a whole.
All right, cool. And there's definitely like a point where inconvenient becomes tedious, and we obviously don't want it.
Exactly.
Moving on, next question from Furyhorn. I love this question. Do you feel artistic integrity arguments carry any weight after the Twitter selfie patch?
So yes, patch 6.1. I think artistic integrity arguments always carry some weight. I think we do intensely value our work product and what goes into the game and the experience we provide players. So let me use this as a little digression to explain the so-called Twitter selfie patch. Twitter integration is, again, I kind of, the way I alluded to earlier in the context of something like time walking that was the product of a few programmers' work. Twitter integration isn't something that was in any way coming away from the creation of outdoor content. It was something that was mostly a couple of programmers working to integrate the Twitter API for logging into the game. We thought it would be a neat thing to do. It wasn't a high priority feature. It's not the kind of thing that we would have held the patch back to make sure it happened. It was just kind of a convenience for players who already use Twitter. Plenty of people tweet WoW screenshots, tweet about things they're doing in WoW. We see it all the time. Well, this makes it a bit simpler to do that from in the game. It's optional. It's not something that's in your face. If you don't care about Twitter, you never want to use Twitter, you probably don't even know that it exists, nor would you need to. You have to go into an interface option to enable it. It's, I don't think there's any harm coming from it, and it didn't directly take away from content creation resources that were going into that patch. Now, the Selfie Cam, that was basically just a fun side project where one designer, one programmer saw, hey, we're doing Twitter integration. Wouldn't it be fun if we could do selfies? And they both came in for a couple of weekends kind of as a side project for fun and made it happen because they thought it would be a cool toy.
Right.
And at the end of the day, there is actually artistic integrity in that. I think there is creativity and initiative and passion. And I think even if you hate the idea of the selfie cam, I think you want to play a World of Warcraft where the people who work on the game have the freedom to pursue little side passion projects if that's something that excites them. And I think a lot of the things that have come into the game, whether it was the Brawlers Guild or hunter pets that are challenge tames that are hard to track down, or little toys or Easter eggs, they're the product of an individual's initiative. And they're just designers doing something that, they find engaging, that they think is going to make the game more fun for some group of players. I think the selfie cam certainly did, personally. Again, we're not seriously saying, nor should we be, okay, you don't get new content, you don't get new quests, you don't get a new dungeon, but look at this selfie cam, isn't it sweet? Of course not.
Right.
That would be silly. And honestly, 6.1 as a patch was extremely light on content. And I think it probably almost would have been better served if we'd called it 6.0.5 or something like that in terms of the expectations that were created. We were just coming off the heels of launching an expansion, and spanning that gap was also the holiday break where, after a long grind to get Warlords done, most of us do take vacations for at least a couple of weeks in the second half of December. And there wasn't a lot of time to, make a whole lot of new content there, but we wanted to get a bug fix patch out, some general quality of life improvements. We improved some things about Garrison UI. We improved some rewards, added a bit more structure. But there's a reason why the patch didn't have a formal name like, Landfall or Siege of Orgrimmar. And that's because it wasn't advancing the story tremendously. It was just a small set of updates. And I apologize to the extent that, we misled people or people felt misled about the intended scope of the patch. We knew it wasn't. It's not a patch like 6.2 that has an outdoor zone and a raid and a bunch of other features.
Right. Okay. We are starting to run out of time, but we can try to get through a couple other questions. This one comes from Camacardzy, who says, why are Tier 18 PvE and PvP gear sets recolors of each other? Doesn't really help player identity.
So I think this is something where if we look back to how it worked in Mists of Pandaria, the only thing that differentiated players in terms of skill or accomplishment was color. If you saw somebody with a set of armor, you needed to know, oh, is it the red color? That means that they're a mythic or a heroic raider and they're killing the hardest bosses in the game. Or if it's blue, I guess that means that, they're just in a regular raiding guild and they're good but not, the very best. And it wasn't really reasonable to expect people to have color as the signifier of that. And so we wanted to move from a world where there was one set of armor for PvE and one set of armor for PvP, and then different colors are what we use to distinguish LFR from normal from heroic, to a world where there's one set of armor for sort of average accomplishment, and then a different set that is sort of an uber version of that for extreme accomplishment. And then
Right.
the color differentiates the activity type.
Yeah.
And so the reds and the blacks and sort of some of the more sinister tones are what's present on the PvP gear. This is the system that we had in place back in Burning Crusade. Remember I want to say Season 2 gear was basically recolors of, Black Temple raid gear, but that read very well. When you saw someone with that gear, you knew that they had achieved a certain rating to earn it, or that they had killed a certain challenging raid boss to earn it. And the look is something that is more apparent and reads better than just the color variation.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's an important sort of point to drive home there,
Yeah.
is that there's still two sets of gear that have been made. It's just that instead of it being the PvE and the PvP set, it's the normal set and the awesome set.
Yeah, we sliced it horizontally instead of vertically, if that makes any sense, right? In terms of the separation of PvE versus PvP, and then tiers of skill.
Okay. If we have time for a couple more questions.
Definitely, yeah.
Okay. Pharaoh Meta asks, why are there no agility weapons that drop off Archimonde? All the agility classes don't get 735 weapons.
So, okay, yes, itemization and itemization progression throughout Hellfire Citadel. To nitpick a little bit, the reality is the vast majority of players in the game aren't going to get 735 weapons, because most people aren't going to kill Mythic Archimonde. But I realize that's not an actual satisfactory answer to your question. So, a couple things about our goals here. We've realized, looking at how raid loot worked out in Highmaul and Blackrock Foundry, that with a single flat item level for the entire zone, but bosses that increase in difficulty as you go deeper into the zone, as we always have, what players experience is actually their kills later in the zone become progressively less and less rewarding in relative terms. Set pieces and maybe a couple of trinkets notwithstanding. A guild that finally kills Blast Furnace on Heroic after 2.5 months in Foundry will very often disenchant everything that drops from the boss except for the set tokens, because they have 685 gear of other types in almost every slot after 10 plus weeks clearing the rest of the zone. Similarly, we saw plenty of guilds skip end bosses entirely. Many people would go 6 of 7 Highmaul in normal, and rather than kill Margok for yet another 655 that they already had, they could jump right into Heroic and get 670s. And that felt off, right? We want risk and reward to be somewhat commensurate. And so that led to the idea of items simply getting stronger as you go deeper and deeper into the zone. That's why that works that way. Now, the other question is, well, if you're going to have a tier of gear, you should have complete itemization in all the important slots in that tier. Two answers to that. I think, first off, I think it would make the itemization overall less interesting if we felt forced to say, okay, there needs to be complete coverage of every weapon slot on Archimonde. There also needs to be complete coverage of every weapon slot on Manaroth and the couple of bosses preceding it. Otherwise, you don't get access to the 730 or what have you. But the other thing, I think, more accurately, is talking about and seeing this as a continuous progression through a tier and through a series of difficulties. Most guilds that are going to kill, let's say, normal Archimonde are going to then move on to Heroic Hellfire Citadel, where they have access to the first 3 or 4 bosses that also drop the exact same loot as normal Archimonde. Another way of viewing this, for, let's say, the Mythic Guild, that the agility user who feels like they don't have a best-in-slot weapon appropriate for them off of Archimonde, is, well, when your guild is working on Archimonde, you're going to have a 730 that you're using, but someone else may not have a 730 at all and actually will be less advantaged in Archimonde. Yeah. So I think in reality, the people who are harmed by this are people who are sort of, if you finish the entire expansion, the entire tier in this case, and you have 735 gear from Mythic Archimonde, Archimonde is on farm, then it's just about maximizing your parses every week and seeing how high you can rank. But there's a reason why sites actually compare people by spec. So if that's what you're concerned with, you're going to be competing with people against people with the same items and access to the same items. Overall, though, the goal here is for guilds to get better and better gear as they progress through the zone, and we think this achieves that.
Okay. Yeah, and so it's almost like maybe as an agility class, you don't get necessarily that 735 weapon off of Mythic Archimonde, but going into progression on Mythic Archimonde, you might have a better weapon than your caster friend or something like that.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, that is all the time that we had set aside for today. There were obviously a lot of questions that we didn't get to, so I'm going to try and see what other answers we can get out
for sure.
those through like the forums or wherever in the future. But thank you so much for coming here on a Saturday and hanging out with us and answering all these questions. Was there
pleasure as always.
Was there anything that you wanted to bring up that we didn't get to?
No, I think we covered most of it. So yeah, most of the big hits anyway.
Okay. Cool.
But yeah, I'll take a look at other submitted questions and see if I can get some posts up on the forums.
Okay.
Or
Cool. Awesome.
Something like that.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that as well. And thanks everybody for hanging out. We are going to go ahead. I know that Wowhead is doing a sort of like post discussion on what we were able to talk about here in the Q&A today. So we're going to be hosting them here on Twitch TV/Wow. If you'd like to check that out, just hang out, and that will be popping up here in just a moment. But again, thank you so much.
Sounds great.
Thanks everybody for hanging out, and we will see you guys later.